In this video tutorial, we'll look at a painting technique that results in a high level of realism. This is an indirect painting method in which we start with an underpainting of monochromatic tones. In this case, I'll use gray. You can see that there are shapes already drawn on the panel that correspond with values in the photograph to the right. I've started with the lightest gray, and I'm simply filling in all of the shapes that I've already drawn that I believe match that gray. We'll continue the same process of filling in each shape with its corresponding value until we get to the darkest value on our palette. At this point in the painting, you don't want to try to blend any of the separate values together. In fact, creating separation between your values ensures that you see and understand the form of your subject, each individual plane. At this point, I should recognize that these values will eventually be blended together. And when they are blended together, they tend to homogenize just a bit. So for this first step in the underpainting, blocking in each separate value, I want to make sure that I can clearly see a distinct difference between each value. And if that means pushing the value scale to its outer edges or widening the gap between each value that I use in comparison to the original photograph, that's okay. The advantage to working with the indirect method is that you address your subject several times. First with the drawing, where I've tried to create shapes out of the values that I see. And second with the underpainting. Now as I make this underpainting, I'll notice changes or differences between my subject and my painting that I may not have noticed when I first drew the subject, and I can make adjustments to these shapes of value as I go along. After the underpainting is complete, the overpainting will be yet a third pass over this same subject, again giving me an opportunity to find and correct mistakes. At this point, I'm getting down to some of the darker values, which become smaller shapes in the case of the subject at hand. It's important to recognize these dark areas as shapes, not marks or brushstrokes, but as actual shapes that lock in with the lighter shapes to fit together tightly, just like a puzzle. The smaller shapes that make up the eye are subtle. In order not to lose those shapes, again, we'll want to exaggerate the lightness and darkness of some of those shapes so that when they're blended together, we don't entirely lose these smaller strokes, these smaller shapes. So the darker accents that are underneath the top eyelid and also that make up the fold of the top eyelid, I'm going to make sure that they really stand out at this point in the painting. The values that make up the inside of the nostril match some of the accents along the eye, so I'll start filling those in now. No matter how many portraits I paint, I'll never entirely feel comfortable about this part. It always feels like my brush is somewhere it doesn't belong. You may have noticed that at the beginning of this video tutorial I was painting in larger shapes, and now I've gotten to some tighter, smaller areas, but my brush has not changed. I'm using the same brush. I have not cleaned it out with any sort of brush cleaner or liquid in any way, only wiping it off on a towel. And I'll try to use the tip of the brush so that I can paint tiny shapes, as well as the broader, flatter side of the brush when working on larger areas. Trying to really maximize the efficiency of this one brush. Because the indirect method of painting begins with a drawing, and your values are already considered and pre-planned to some degree, you can paint or start anywhere. And I usually choose to start on the left side and also sometimes at the top, working my way from left to right as though I were writing a sentence. Okay, well, I've discovered a mistake in one of my shapes, one of the darker shapes over the eye. And so I'm going to correct that, and in order to do so, I'm not going to take a different color paint and try to mix it in, causing my paint to get too thick, but instead I wiped off the paint that was darker where it didn't belong. It may not have appeared to be wiped away because the value did stain my canvas, but there was in fact no paint, just the darker gray stained area, and then I was able to repaint that with the correct color, not having to worry about whether or not it would mix in with what was underneath. So don't be afraid to remove paint at any stage in your painting, either by wiping it with a paper towel or rag, or you can use your palette knife or a painting knife and just scrape it away. Now, I didn't actually draw the shapes of the inner part of the eye in separately, but I'm still trying to see those areas of color and value as individual shapes. So there's the shape of the highlight, there's the black shape that is the pupil and also some of the shadow right underneath the eyelid. And then there's the lighter brown shape, and I actually see that as two separate values. It's the lighter brown curve that makes up the bottom portion of the iris. I see it as being a little bit lighter on the right and darker on the left. And so I'll split that brown area into two separate shapes as well. I'm not using straight black. There is a tiny bit of white mixed into my darkest value. I would say that it is a charcoal gray, but that'll be dark enough for the pupil. Once I overpaint the eye, the pupil will in fact probably get darker. I don't want to confuse my palette with too many values, and pure black is used so little that it really doesn't even need to be on my palette at this point. The squeaky sound that you keep hearing is me squeezing out the paint off of the end of my brush with a paper towel. I don't want to just wipe off the paint. I'm actually squeezing it out, so it does make an audible sound. But it's important for me to clean my brush that way. I'd rather do that than clean it in brush cleaner, which is going to stay in the bristles, eventually get into my little piles of paint, and thin out my paint. It's important for me to maintain the consistency of the viscosity of my paint. I don't want it to be thinner in some areas and a thicker viscosity in others. So no brush cleaner. I hope you've enjoyed part 1 of this video series on the indirect painting method. Be sure to watch part 2, where we'll blend these separate patchy values together to create a smooth gradation.